Hello, everyone, and welcome to Police Off the Cuff Real Crime Stories. Today, I have a very interesting guest, and we're going to do another show on the Law and Crime author series. And the author is an exciting author, an academic, uh, loads of experience. I'll put the thumbnail up on the screen. The name of the book is The Bulldog Detective, Dr. Jeffrey D. Simon, and he's going to appear today. And you see that rather rotund detective to the left. That's how detectives used to look back in the 20s before they discovered that if you go through a police career at that weight, you're going to die about 3 years after you retire. Anyway, The Bulldog Detective, very exciting. It's written in the 1920s. I'm going to read his Amazon intro for The Bulldog Detective. We'll keep this on the screen. The Bulldog Detective, William J. Flynn and America's first war against the mafia, spies, and terrorists. And it came out on January 16th, 2024. Of course, that's Dr. Simon on the screen, and to the right, smiling because I guess he's selling a lot of books at that bookstore. America in the early 20th century was rife with threats. Organized crime groups like the mafia, German spies embedded behind enemy lines ahead of World War I, package bombs sent throughout the country, and the 1920 Wall Street bombing dominated headlines. Yet the story of the one man tasked with combating these threats has yet to be told. The Bulldog Detective, William J. Flynn, and America's first war against the mafia, spies, and terrorists is the first book to tell the story of Flynn, the first government official to bring down the powerful mafia, uncover a sophisticated German spy ring in the United States, and launch a formal war on terrorism on his way to becoming one of the most respected and effective law enforcement officials in American history. Long before Elliot Ness and the Untouchables went from Al Capone and the Italian mob in Chicago, Flynn dismantled the first mafia family to exist in America. Next stop for the indefatigable crime fighter would be chief of the Secret Service, where he would set his crosshairs on the country's most notorious currency counterfeiters. Coined the Bulldog for his tenacity, Flynn's fame soared as he exposed Kaiser Germany's sophisticated spy and sabotage ring on the cusp of America's entry into World War I. As the director of the Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, the Bulldog would devise the first counter-terrorist strategy in U.S. history. In his riveting biography, author Jeffrey D. Simon brings to life the forgotten saga of one of America's greatest crime and terrorist fighters. Exquisitely researched, the Bulldog Detective finally uncovers the important legacy of this fascinating man who will now no longer be lost in history. Wow, sounds tremendously interesting. And with us today is Dr. Jeffrey Simon. I'm not going to read his whole bio because but Jeffrey Simon is an internationally recognized author, lecturer, and consultant on terrorism and political violence. He's the president of the Political Risk Assessment Company, Incorporated, and a former lecturer at UCLA. He's the author of 4 books on terrorism: America's Forgotten Terrorist, The Rise and Fall of the Galenist, The Alphabet Bomber, A Lone Wolf Terrorist Ahead of His Time, Lone Wolf Terrorism, Understanding the Growing Threat and the Terrorist Trap, America's Experience with Terrorism. His latest book, The Bulldog Detective, William J. Flynn and America's First War Against the Mafia, Spies, and Terrorists, will be published, of course, this January 2024. His writings on terrorism, political violence, and political risk have appeared in many publications, including the Journal of the American Medical Association Foreign Policy, Jane's Intelligence Review, and the New York Times. I could keep reading, but I think what we really want to do, since he's here, we should introduce Dr. Jeffrey D. Simon. Dr. Simon, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
You know, the amazing thing about this, in my police career, responded to 2 major terrorist incidents. Of course, one was 9/11, and the second one was the Times Square bomber, who, thank God for the ineptitude of some of these guys. The Times Square bomber loaded his car with propane gas tanks, and in his own car, and with his own license plates and everything, and the bomb didn't go off. Thank God, because that would have killed hundreds of people that were in that crowded Times Square area at that time. So, as I said to you before we came on the air, the amazing thing about this, Dr. Simon, is that from the 1920s, now 100 years later, not that much has changed, has it?
Now, you know, what's amazing, and I'll get into this as we go through the whole story about Flynn, was that in a period in 1919, within a month, there were first 30 package bombs sent across the country targeting high profile people, including the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, and other government officials and judges and so forth. Then a month after the package bombs, 9 bombs went off in 7 cities in a 2-hour period on June 2nd, including a terrorist who actually was able to walk up the steps of the home of the Attorney General, and that terrorist fell and the bomb went off, killing him. But can you imagine today if 9 bombs went off in 7 cities, and before that, package bombs have been sent? People forget. Terrorism has been with us for a long, long time, and unfortunately, you just can never totally eliminate it.
Doctor, the other thing is now, as my last 10 years of my 27 years on the NYPD, I was in Manhattan North Homicide Squad. And one of the things that has greatly aided investigations is video surveillance. Video is everywhere. And I think it was modeled after the London, the Ring of Steel, they called it,
Right.
because they had those subway bombers and they had a tremendous problem with terrorism in London. And now New York City's wired all over the place. You probably can't go anywhere in New York City without being caught on video. And that is where the investigation usually starts. Now it'll be rare that a perpetrator isn't caught on camera somewhere, and the investigator now link that up also to other technology like facial recognition, cell phone technology, digital it's back in 1920, they didn't have that. They had to take the signature of the bombs and figure out who did it, right?
Oh, exactly. Pieces here, pieces there. It was the technology was not available yet. The law enforcement were very smart. They were very capable in terms of trying to put some of these things together. But not all terrorists were caught. A lot of times the crime was not solved.
Well, look how long the Unabomber was out there.
Now, the Unabomber, that's an interesting case, because we hear today about lone wolves, lone wolf terrorism. And some people argue, well, lone wolf is never really alone because they're radicalized by the internet or social media, and they're inspired by groups and they feel like they're part of a group. But Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was the true lone wolf because he just lived, off the radar in Montana, and he was very bright, and he couldn't be caught because he wasn't really leaving traces. They couldn't figure it out until the manifesto was published in the newspapers, and then the brother recognized it, and that's how he was caught.
We always depend on the stupidity of criminals, to get themselves caught, and usually they cooperate with us because
the first World Trade Center bombing. Remember the van?
They went back to get their deposit. Brilliant.
That has to be at the top of the list. And actually, just an interesting side note: the book I wrote before this, The Gallianus, I was interviewing some people within the FBI, and one had been with the Boston police, and he told me a story where they were after a gang, and they got the leader of the gang. They brought him in, or one of the members, and he said, "No, I'm not a member of the XYZ street gang." They said, "Look, we know you are." And he said, "No, I'm not." So they say, "Take off your shirt." He takes off his shirt, and there's the whole tattoo of the XYZ
exactly.
gang. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, the Tsarnaev brothers. The scary thing about that is that the FBI knew all about them, and they knew that they were radicalized. And I think the oldest one, I know there was Zokhar Tsarnaev, and there, what's the other one's name? Tamerlan. Tamerlan, I believe, was the older one.
Yeah.
He was in Chechnya being trained in a terror, and they knew about it.
Yeah.
And I just, those are the things that baffle us. Like, how did they know about this guy? And I mean, look how quickly they ID'd them from social media video that people took at the finish line. And then they compared that to Facebook. And before you know it, those guys were identified. And look, I have to say this, NYPD, Boston Police departments, when they get someone ID'd in a case like that, they want to put it out there immediately, which is the right thing to do. The FBI goes the opposite way. And the FBI actually pulled rank on Chief Davis from Boston with some political hack and said, no, keep it quiet. And then what do the Zarnaev brothers do? They execute a campus security officer, a
Yeah.
cop.
Yeah.
And so what was correct? Well, correct was to put them out there so everyone knew who the hell they were. Look, they were heading to New York.
Yeah. And the other thing also, what the bombing shows is how difficult sometimes it is to prevent these kinds of acts in terms of the strategy of the terrorists. Because here, they could have put that bomb anywhere along the 26-mile route. You can't protect, 26 miles. And at the
Right.
finish line, they could just blend in, with everyone else who's watching, the end of the race.
Yeah, we do things like ban backpacks, right?
Yeah.
And
But
well, in the perimeter, I think that's probably the right thing to
yeah,
do, and they were using that device with the pressure cooker.
yeah,
That was the fruit. That was the flavor of the terrorists back then. I don't know if they're still using them. They actually used one in New York
yeah.
um, during uh, O'Neill, Commissioner O'Neill's term down in Chelsea. Same thing. It's like, and it blew apart some big garbage container, but it didn't kill anybody.
Now
But
you know how they
using
got
the
the
same
idea.
type of thing.
You know how they got the idea because both Al Qaeda and ISIS in their magazines online were giving instructions on how you build pressure bombs. That's how they learned it. Pressure cooker bombs.
Right,
So
right. And
because
it
it's
seems like well, back in the day of the Weather Underground, it was pipe bombs, right?
right.
And did that
Another
go the way of the horse and buggy or what?
another quick side story about the Weather Underground. I grew up in Brooklyn and I went to Midwood High School, which was like in the Flatbush area of Brooklyn. And in my graduating class was Judith Clark, who was one of the Weather Underground, who was just, I think, pardoned and released about a year ago. But she was involved with the Weather Underground and a Brinks armored truck robbery in Nyack, New York, where a number of people were killed. Also, in my high school was a woman who was a hostage in a PFLP, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine hijacking in 1970. It was one of the most spectacular hijackings ever. And when I looked at my high school yearbook, all three of us, terrorist, the hostage, and myself, were in a group picture for the honor
Oh,
society.
good. That's great for the sales of your book.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it's a small world, but yeah, you're right.
It's amazing how these things are so, when they occur, it's like everyone wants these people put to death. And then as years go by, the Bowdens, she was hired as a professor at Columbia University. Her son was the district attorney in San Francisco,
Right.
and the father just got pardoned. But
Yeah.
I think all of them are very, or the wife who was teaching at Columbia, she passed away, I think, a year or two ago.
Yeah.
But I'm amazed at that. Like, really, Columbia, you want to hire a former terrorist as a professor? Yeah, that's what they
Yeah.
do there. I guess UCLA probably does the same shit.
I mean, it's yeah, like I say, the whole terrorism, the whole controversy we see, it's nothing's new. That's what's amazing. It's
Yeah.
that's
Let's
why.
take a look at this little rotund detective here, William J. Flynn, uh, and America's first war against the mafia spy. It sort of just makes me laugh because that was like a stereotypical look, I guess, back in the 20s, very dapper, but that overweight, out of
Oh,
shape detective. And we laugh at it on the NYPD because even when I came on the job in 1985, the old timers were all out of shape, cigarette smoking, heavy drinking. Uh, they do their 20, 25, 30, whatever it was on the job, and then they would live for 2 or 3 years and die.
yeah.
They never got a chance because they lived a horrible lifestyle when they were on the police department. And look, police work, if you really do the job, it's not an 8 hours, 8.5 hours, and you go home. You live the job. And because of that, sometimes you do live that horrible, we call it cop food, pizza, Chinese food, cheeseburger diet, because you need that energy to work those long hours. And it's not the hell, you got to make sure that you do try to stay in shape. Do try to work out and you do try to have a healthy diet, or when you do retire, you're not going to live too long.
But what's amazing about Flynn, see, that photo was great, because that is just everything about it. Because he looks so, I mean, almost you could think, is that a racing form, in his pocket in the
Yeah.
back, and the way he's walking and everything. He was about 300 pounds. But he had a brief period where he was a deputy commissioner of the NYPD. And when he had that job, he basically got rid of the people who looked like him. He said, I'm replacing all these old timers who can't even run. They're no longer going to be the detectives. I want young people to be the detectives. And he like reorganized the detective bureau of the NYPD. But no, yeah, Flynn, he liked to eat, and he was a big man. I can't hear you. Hello? I'm not hearing you. Hello?
So I didn't put myself back on the screen. I was saying I used to tend bar at a place called Pete's Tavern on
Oh,
18th Street in Irving Place before I came on the police department. And it's a famous bar in American history because it's still there. It's been there since 1864. And it was, of course, down the street from Tammany Hall, which I believe was on 14th Street.
right.
And all the politicians would go into Tammany Hall, and legend has it they would cut deals at the bar and all this other stuff. But it was politicians and wise guys and criminals and everything all alike that would drink at Pete's Tavern since 1864.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I just gave them a free commercial. I didn't even intend on it.
I One time I was in New York. I went to go get something to eat, and I was near Sparks. I think it was Sparks Steakhouse,
Yes.
and I knew that's ringing a bell, and I can't figure why is it ringing a bell. And I went in there, and then there, the whole thing with the killing, mafia.
Yeah, that was when Gotti took over, and
Yeah. So,
you and Sammy. I've had Sammy the Bull on the show, and he talked about that.
oh, really? Really?
Yeah, he was in the car with Gotti.
Yeah.
He was a backup shooter.
Wow.
So, but yeah, Sparks. That was like 1985. That's what the year I came on the job. That
Oh,
happened.
wow.
Yeah,
So
right,
you had a
right in
long, you had
front
a
of the
long
place.
career there. That's great.
And Tommy Bellotti, I think it was his driver. I think they whacked him too,
Hmm.
two for the price of one.
Wow.
And they were all wearing these Russian hats, so as people would like just look at the hat and not look at their face,
Oh,
and it's
really?
like a distraction. Yeah, there was supposedly a bunch of shooters. They want to make sure that they got him, and they did. They did
Oh,
get him.
yeah. Definitely.
So,
Yeah.
all right, let's talk about Flynn.
Okay.
You have in the book also that he went after the mafia, and who were
Yeah.
the big names in the mafia back then?
It was the Morello Lupo gang, Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo. Now, what they were basically the first mafia family in New York, and even almost you could almost say, in the U.S. And they went after, they did extortion, murders, kidnapping, but mainly also counterfeiting. Now, one of their strategies in terms of the extortions was to what was called black hand letters. They would send black hand letters. It'd be a letter with a black hand, which meant either pay or die, or in the hand would be a dagger or a knife. And they would say to the wealthy Italian businessmen, "You pay, or we're going to blow up your shop, we're going to kill you, or we're going to kidnap your children." And they did that to those who didn't pay. And Flynn, basically, his beginning is with the Secret Service, and the Secret Service job was to go after counterfeiters. So he's surveilling, doing a lot of surveillance over this Morello Lupo gang because they were involved in counterfeiting. And he notices somebody new hanging out with them. And then the next day, there's a body in a barrel in the streets of New York. The Morello Lupo gang believed that one of their members had cooperated with the Secret Service and they wanted to kill him, but he was now in prison. He was, the Flynn, they put him in prison, so they had to get one of his relatives, a brother-in-law. So they lure the brother-in-law to this shop where they kill him and then dump the body, in the middle of this Manhattan in a barrel. So Flynn now is looking to see how I can have evidence against this Morello Lupo gang for this what's called the barrel murder. And Flynn keeps 9 years after this case. He doesn't give up. That's why he was called the Bulldog, tenacity, until he was finally able to get them on a counterfeiting charge. And the judge, when he handed down the counterfeiting, gave Lupo and gave Morello like 25 to 30 years prison sentence, which was astonishing for counterfeiting. But the judge knew they were probably responsible for that murder, so it's sort of like getting them for that too.
Back then, and even somewhat in my day, the way you got criminals to come around was to hit them in the pocket, and specifically with wise guys. All right, shut down their gambling, shut down the prostitution, shut down their whole operation, and we call it shaking the tree. You
Yeah,
shake the tree, something's gonna pop out of that tree and
yeah.
give up because you're hurting them in their pocket. And if they need to give up a rival to do that, they'll do it. There's no honor among thieves, as you
No,
know.
no, no, not at all. And what's interesting is how I even got into writing this book. I knew many people in the Secret Service, many people, historians, never don't really know who William J. Flynn was, even though during his period he was like a media rock star. I mean, he was written about all the time. He was a prolific writer himself. He had he wrote pieces for newspapers and things along those lines. So when I decided, I think, I'm going to write a book about him, but am I going to find enough information? So through the magic of the internet, I tracked down his grandson, and his
Wow.
grandson was, more than thrilled. Oh, you're going to write a book about my grandfather? Let me give you some anecdotes. Let me give you some photos. Then the problem is, am I going to have enough information to write about 80, 90,000 words, which is basically a book? And then found out how Flynn would write a lot himself. There was all kinds of material in the archives. Got a lot of great cooperation, from the Secret Service with their, the archivists there, and so it was just really a great journey just getting started. And I knew about Flynn just in terms of what he did in terms of going after the terrorists, the anarchists in 1920, but I didn't know about his earlier period. And he was amazing. He always wanted to be a Secret Service agent, and he becomes head of the New York office in 1901. And that's where he's going after the Morello Lupo gang, and he's going after counterfeiters. And then when he's able to get those lengthy prison sentences against the gang, he joins the NYPD as a deputy commissioner. And it wasn't a great experience for him because he came across a lot of bureaucratic infighting. He wanted to reform the detective bureau by bringing them under his command, and that they wouldn't report to the precincts. They'd be in the precincts, but he'd be in charge of all the detectives, and he'd keep what they're doing secret. And there's a great anecdote in the book. One of Flynn's tasks was to raid gambling houses. So he tells his detectives, 13 of them, all right, look, I'm not telling you what we're going to do today or where we're going to hit, but meet me at the subway station on 50th Street, in Midtown Manhattan. So they go there. They're waiting for Flynn to arrive. He comes in a car, gets out of the car, opens the trunk, and gives each of them crowbars and axes. And he says, okay, guys, we're marching 3 blocks down to this gambling house. You're going to break down the door. Some of you are going through the ceiling. But I could just imagine broad daylight, these 13 tough looking guys walking with crowbars and axes, in Midtown Manhattan. People think, are these criminals? Who
Right,
are these people?
exactly.
So
It's interesting that Flynn started as a Fed with the Secret Service, and then went on to the NYPD as a deputy commissioner. So he must have been politically hung for that to happen. I mean, he
well,
was connected.
yeah, he wasn't. Actually, he was not a political animal. That's what's amazing. He basically had become so famous after the Morello Lupo thing that the mayor of New York then wanted some high profile, law enforcement official to take over, become one of the deputy commissioners. But one of the things about Flynn, he was incorruptible. And I think the reason he was incorruptible was he really didn't play those political backroom, maneuverings. He was savvy and he knew how to use the media, but he wasn't really built for all this, bureaucratic, politics and things along those lines. But yeah, he always, since a boy, wanted to be a Secret Service agent. That was his dream as a kid.
Dr. Simon, people always will try to say that, oh, I don't want to get political. And there is no arm of the government that is more affected by politics than law enforcement.
Yeah.
I always say the P in police stands for politics because what the police do, how they enforce laws, the tactics they use, it's all uh, done by politicians. And to the to the detriment, in my opinion, to law enforcement, some of the tools that they've taken away from law enforcement. And all, in New York, they have this crazy thing called the diaphragm law, where when a cop makes an arrest, he can't put his knee into the back of the perpetrator in order to get him cuffed, which is insane, because you can't get someone cuffed that doesn't want to get cuffed without putting your weight on them, getting rid of qualified immunity, um, all kinds of different things that have hurt the police department. And so I don't want to make this about politics, but
Yeah.
just putting that into it, that yeah, politics. You say 1920, Flynn, the Bulldog Detective, he didn't like the politics, but guess what? It's been with us forever and will always be with us. Politics.
Oh,
The
sure.
whole, defund the police movement. Like that's politics.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, definitely. He couldn't ignore it. But he didn't. He just didn't try to, maneuver himself, within the political machines and all that.
Yeah, and something like the idea of the detective bureau, like answering to the chief of the detectives, that was always an idea in New York City because
Yeah.
the detective bureau wanted to be insulated from patrol, which are the regular Monday to Friday uniform cops on the street. Which every police department will say patrol is the backbone of the police of any police department, and it's true. But the first thing any cop wants to do is get the hell out of that uniform
Yeah.
and get off patrol because it's the most dangerous assignment and it's the most high profile assignment. And you're out in the public eye 24/7 of your career. And most people would rather put a suit and tie on or dress down like a narcotics detective or an undercover because being in uniform, you are the target.
Yeah, yeah. And Flynn wanted to keep, his people secret from others within, the NYPD. And eventually, he was kind of, he said, I had it. There's just too much obstacles occurring, and he called it a thankless job. He loved police work, but he felt that he wasn't allowed to do what he wanted. He didn't want to do gambling raids. He didn't want to go after he wanted to go after murderers and extortionists, and so forth. And actually, Teddy Roosevelt said that being commissioner of the NYPD is the hardest job in the world. Is harder than even being president. So
I think it is because of what we just discussed, the
yeah,
politics of New York City. Think of a city probably has 150, 200 different ethnic groups
oh,
in
totally.
the city, all that are looking for their piece of the pie, uh, and bring all their customs and their laws and their rules and their mores to this country. And yet, this is America. This is New York City. This is how we do things, and you
Oh,
can
sure.
just, I guess, bend so far and then you got to enforce the law too.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, after Flynn, left the NYPD, it was only about 8 months that he's with them. He goes back to the Secret Service, and he's back head of the New York office. And about 2 years later, he's promoted to chief of the Secret Service. Today they call it director, but in those days it was the chief. And he's a New Yorker. He loves New York. So when the Treasury Secretary says, "Okay, we want you now. You're going to head the whole Secret Service. Come on down to Washington," he goes, "No, I don't want to leave New York. I love New York." And they say, "Well, you have to." He says, "Well, I have an idea." And they say, "What?" "Why don't you move the headquarters of the Secret Service to New York?" And I always say, only somebody like Flynn, and really, I grew up in New York, so a true New Yorker, would say something like that, like, "Okay, move it to us. I'm not coming down there." But he worked it out so he could stay in New York, but he would have a lower salary and he'd have to pay for his travels, back and forth. And he was
He
chief.
probably had sponsors.
Oh, totally, totally. And
Yeah.
while he was chief of the Secret Service, he achieved one of the greatest counter espionage victories almost in U.S. history. What happened was, after World War One broke out, the U.S. didn't enter. We didn't enter World War One until 1917, but the war broke out in 1914. So the Germans brought a whole intelligence unit to New York to work on how they can sabotage. Even though we were supposed to be neutral, we were still trading with Britain, and Britain was blockading Germany. So Germany was saying, well, the U.S. really isn't neutral. They're allowing the ships to go to Britain and everything. So we got to do something about that. So they get a propaganda campaign going against Britain, and they get a sabotage campaign going against all the ships that are going off to Britain, and they try to bribe dock workers to go on strike. So all this is happening, and President Wilson says to the Treasury Secretary, "Look, I want to find out evidence on these guys. I want to see exactly what are the Germans up to. So you, Treasury Secretary, go to the Secret Service, because Secret Service was under the Treasury Department in those days. Now it's under Homeland Security, and see what they're up to." So Flynn, as head of the Secret Service, is in charge of this. He forms a special 11-man unit. He puts his best man in charge of it. His name was Frank Burke. And he says, "Look, let's find out. Let's see what they're doing." So Burke's in his office one day, and he gets a call from one of his guys saying, "Something suspicious going on in this building. Why don't you come down? We want to see who comes out of it." So Burke joins his colleague, and they see one guy they had under surveillance. He was American, who was doing propaganda in his newspaper for the Germans. But then they see a very well-dressed man come out who's carrying a briefcase, and they're getting suspicious, like, who is this guy? We don't really know who he is. So they follow him onto an elevated train, the L train, that's going up Fifth Avenue. I believe it was going up Fifth Avenue, and not Flynn, Burke sits behind one of the guys. His colleague sits next to somebody else, and they're keeping their eyes on them. When the propagandist person leaves, Burke is left alone just to look at the diplomat with the briefcase. He then remembers that there was some top level German official that was coming to the US, and he remembers now the name and the face, and he says, "This must be, Dr. Albert," very high level German official. He wants to know what's in that briefcase. Albert is sitting next to the briefcase, reading a book, and the train stops at 50th Street, and Albert panics. He can't miss his stop. So he runs out before the doors are closing, gets out, but leaves his briefcase there. Burke takes the briefcase, runs out, and then Albert is trying to get back in, realizing his briefcase is there, can't get in, and he knows now somebody took it. And he then sees Burke in the street with the briefcase, and he's just chasing after him. So we have a German agent chasing after a Secret Service agent who has a briefcase, who's running away from him, jumps onto a streetcar and tells the conductor, "See that crazy man waving his hands? He caused a scene on the subway. Keep going, keep going." So they're able to avoid, any interference from the German. So Burke calls Flynn. Flynn drives over to meet him, and they open the briefcase, and they see all these documents about a $27 million campaign to sabotage, the docks, to sabotage ships. And Secret Service has a problem. They can't go ahead and admit that they took the briefcase, because that may cause a diplomatic uproar. So they give the contents to the New York World newspaper they trusted, and the New York World for 3 days has front page expose on what the Germans are up to. And that leads to the expulsion of a number of Germans. It raises American consciousness about what the Germans were up to, during this pre-war period for the U.S. entry. And it was just an amazing feat, and it led to Flynn's fame even more so.
And I love how they offered a $20 reward for the return of the briefcase. It doesn't seem like doesn't seem like enough money for something like that.
Yeah, and I thought about that, and I realized if they offered a large reward, maybe that would be a red flag for somebody. Hey, maybe there's really something valuable in it, or I don't know.
Right.
But it really was crazy just putting the $20 in. But they say in the book they didn't realize no matter how much they offered, they weren't going to get it back. And
It's amazing. Even back then, here they uncover this briefcase that's obviously spy related. It's a plot against our country, and yet they're concerned with the political ramifications of admitting that they have it.
Yeah. Well, but it was serious in the sense that because of the war going on and everything, in Europe, there could have been a lot of diplomatic upheavals of the U.S. interfering. But yeah, I mean, you're right in that sense. But they didn't need to admit that we took it. Just getting it into the newspaper was what achieved their purpose because it raised
Yeah,
the awareness. Now,
absolutely.
years later, Flynn admitted to it. He said, "Yeah, yeah, we took it." And Flynn, he was such a media savvy guy that after he leaves the Secret Service in 1917, there are movies made about this whole episode about the German, espionage. And Flynn actually, I think, appears in one little bit of it, and he writes a book about it. So, he was well known during that period.
What was, I'm just interested to know, what was Flynn's educational background?
Public school in New York, quit at the age of 15 when his father died, and had to work to support his family. His mother had, I think he had five siblings. He worked as a plumber, a tinsmith. He was a semi-professional baseball player. Can't imagine that the way he looked,
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
photo, but he was. And he had a successful plumbing business going. He actually was making a lot of money, but he wanted to be the Secret Service agent. So he goes to apply for a job in his mid 20s, and they tell him, look, you got to get experience with counterfeiters. That's what we do. We go after counterfeiters. So there's this jail called the Ludlow Street Jail. Get a job there because while some common criminals are held there, federal counterfeiters who are awaiting trial are held there also. So Flynn gets a job there. He befriends one of the old time famous counterfeiters who tells him tricks of the trade. And then in 1897, Flynn finally, or gets his job with the Secret Service, and he was just happy as a lark.
So basically, with a high school degree, if he even had that, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, he didn't have a high school degree. I
So
didn't
he
even.
actually was, but
Oh,
a smart
wait,
guy,
15, yeah, 15. So he graduated. He probably was in maybe just started high school, but no, he didn't graduate.
like a freshman or a sophomore in high school.
No, no, and he was. But he had the inquisitive nature. The bulldog. He wouldn't give up on anything, and he knew bring good people around. You'd hire good people around him, which as you know, is what any leader does.
Well, doctor, you always hear about someone that's self-taught and street smart. Oh, he's not educated, but he's street smart. And I've seen that over my police career. That people, although today, if you don't have at least a bachelor's degree, then people aren't even going to talk to you.
Yeah.
Which is sort of, I don't know, a little bit of arrogant, I think, because there are those people that are self-educated and very, very smart people.
Oh, totally, totally, and he was one of them, and he had people around him, and he was well liked by everybody who worked with him, and but then when in 1919 when there was all this wave of terrorism going on, the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer needed a high-profile figure to take over this Bureau investigation, which was the forerunner of the FBI. So he appoints Flynn. So Flynn comes into his job in May or June of 1919 with this wave of terrorist attacks, and then has to figure out how do I find out who's responsible. And before that, there was never investigations that went through many different states. There may be a bomb here, a bomb there, local authorities take care of it. But now Flynn had to organize his people to go all over the country, look at every little piece of evidence, and try to piece it together. And they figured out who it was, that it was these Gallianists who were very militant Italian anarchists. And they were never able to pin Galliani, the leader himself, to the crime. They actually deported him, which was a mistake because about a year later, there was the Wall Street bombing that occurred on September 16th, 1920, which all the authorities were convinced it had to be the Gallianist again. But now they couldn't interview Galliani because he was over, in Italy. And this bombing was a horse-drawn wagon with a bomb hidden, in the wagon, goes off at high noon on Wall Street, kills 38 people. and injures many, many more. And it was major, major event. It was not like 9/11, but it was like the Oklahoma City bombing. Got a lot of coverage that day or two. But what happened was Wall Street, J.P. Morgan Bank, which was right across from where the bomb went off, felt, bombing is terrorism. It's not good for business. We got to clean up this mess. So they hired all these cleaning crews that night went in and swept up all the evidence.
All
It's
the
like
evidence.
everything was cleaned up. And so it was a very difficult investigation. And to this day, there's no definitive culprit, although most people, myself included, believe it was Mario Buddha, who was one of the last remaining Gallianists who did this before he fled to Italy.
Doctor, with all of this stuff with investigation, it's so important that police agencies talk to each other and share
Absolutely.
information. And that is like what, even after 9/11, was found out to be a huge weakness of our whole law enforcement, conglomerate, because, you're talking about FBI, CIA, local police, Secret Service, state police, or, all of these organizations that have tremendous power and resources. But when they work solo, it really, it cuts back on the effectiveness of law enforcement. And you saw that in the Gilgo Beach case on Long Island. You know, for years the Suffolk County Police really did a horrific job investigating that, and they kicked the FBI out very early in the investigation. There was other things going on too, corruption and stuff like that. But once they put this like task force together, and that was like a year and a half ago, 3 months later they found out who the guy was.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you see that in this type of work, but yet in the 1920s, they did not have the resources and the tools, of course. And what, speaking about video cameras, digital evidence, computers, all of those things. And when you, like in this one instance with the Wall Street bombing, where they clean up the crime scene, I mean, that was the only hope of maybe linking it to other things. And then
Yeah.
that was,
Absolutely. And getting the cooperation of different agencies was just as difficult then, as today. And everybody wants their turf, and also each agency, each person wants to solve the case. One of the nemesis of Flynn was another guy, you may have heard of him, William J. Burns, the Burns Detective Agency.
yes, yes.
And William J. Burns was like Flynn. He was media savvy also. And these two, that old saying, they didn't like each other, and Burns tried to undermine Flynn's investigation. And so Flynn had a tough job. And when Flynn left the Bureau of Investigation, he doesn't get called for another federal job. He was expecting, something would happen, and nothing happened. That was a big disappointment. But he forms his own detective agency. It didn't really work that well, though. One of his clients was a movie studio that wanted to investigate Rudolph Valentino, the famous silent movie
Yeah,
star,
yeah.
and also safeguard a horse who was racing the Kentucky Derby. But Flynn was used to bigger, better things. But he forms a magazine called Flynn's, which goes on to be one of the most famous detective magazines in history. It lasted for decades. And one of the writers that he hired to write a piece was Agatha Christie at the beginning of her career. So he almost helped launch the career of the famous mystery writer Agatha Christie.
It seems like everything that Flynn touched, he was successful at, which is pretty amazing.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. My only regret was I couldn't find a recording of him. I would have loved to see what his voice sounded like. Some tinny recording, or actually seen him live. Walking in some tinny video. I wasn't able to locate that. But he came alive to me just through all the research, reading about him, and interviewing people. And yeah,
Now,
he was.
what were the memories of his grandson, of his grandfather?
His grandson always would communicate with me, grandfather. He never said Grandpa Willie, Grandpa Bill. Grandfather. His memories came through his mother, because his mother was Flynn's, daughter. So
Daughter.
his mother gave him, all these stories. His memories was all positive. Some things he told me I couldn't verify, so I didn't put in the book. Um, that Flynn rode with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, but he gave me a lot of other stuff that I was able to verify. And it's funny, he has a big gripe. He's really ticked off that the FBI building is called the Hoover Building. He said it should be called the Flynn Building because all Hoover did was put a badge on and make it federal. And but what's interesting is that because Flynn's major career was with the Secret Service, most of the people in the Secret Service, including former directors that I interviewed, say to me they really didn't know that much about him. And now, because of the book, they're thinking they may do something now, to honor him. And but I myself didn't know that much about Flynn, and it'd be like thinking of somebody today who's always in the news. 100 years from now, they're basically forgotten.
Yeah, I think that probably William Bratton will probably go down in New York City history as the person that brought Comstat to New York City,
Yeah,
which lowered the crime rate in conjunction with Rudolph Giuliani to the lowest it's ever been. And that, he could be forgotten too.
no, he was really generous and nice. He wrote a nice endorsement for my book on the back of the book, and he admired Flynn, and so yeah, he definitely is one of those you would be surprised if. But yes, history goes on. I think with Flynn, it could be that he was overshadowed by J. Edgar Hoover, by other people, and as time went on, historians and journalists didn't write about Flynn anymore, and he just fell through the cracks.
There's such a rivalry in law enforcement, even though people in law enforcement would deny it. But even I think when Ray Kelly took over after Bratton, I think there was a certain coldness from Ray Kelly that he showed towards Bratton, uh,
Oh,
not
really?
giving him perhaps the credit for, to me, Bratton drew the blueprint, the blueprint of how the great reduction in crime was going to happen. And with some
Absolutely.
great leaders like John Timoney, Louis Anemone, there's others I'm probably forget, Jack Maple,
Right.
these people that devised Comstat. And then after that, the people that followed, in my opinion, just had to follow the blueprint that was drawn up. You
Yeah.
follow this and you'll be as successful as, and
Yeah.
Kelly was for 12 years, although it sort of imploded near the end with the stop, question, and frisk
Mhm.
overuse in New York City. But yeah, Bratton, he'll be remembered in the annals of law enforcement probably
Sure.
as one of the great police commissioners. And you say like William Flynn, people want to be noticed, people want to be remembered, but that doesn't always happen, right?
No,
Doc,
you
why
hit.
don't we segue now to, and I want to read a little bit more from your LinkedIn. Uh, a former RAND analyst, Dr. Simon has conducted research and analysis on terrorism for more than 30 years. He's lectured and given workshops on terrorism to university audiences, law enforcement, and military personnel, the emergency services, and the medical community, both in the United States and overseas. He's worked with the U.S. Army on many projects, including the Human Social Cultural Behavior Modeling Program and the Soft Target Exploitation Fusion STEF program, particularly in designing scenarios and intelligence tools to track high-value terrorists and extremists. He has conducted studies on the following issues: innovations in terrorist tactics, strategies, weapons, and targets, analysis of the growing threat of lone wolf terrorism, identification of terrorist strategies aimed at defeating biometric technologies, and assessing strategies for dealing with the global IED, improvised explosive device threat. I'm not going to read, that's a lot, and we could probably do a whole show
Very
on that.
lot.
But it's where I'll segue with this, and we got like about 10 minutes. This one's, I told you, an hour goes boom.
Sure, sure.
Um, what's the biggest terrorist threat right now to the United States?
I still see it from the lone wolves. And what I think it is happening now, there's so many issues and so many things going on in the world, whether you look overseas or here at home, that individuals don't necessarily have to be radicalized, through following groups or being told what to do. They can just react almost spontaneously to what they're feeling or what they're seeing. And trying to track the lone wolf, which cuts across the whole political, social spectrum. Lone wolves can be young, they can be old, all kinds of ethnicities and races and everything. That is the most difficult type of terrorist to catch, to identify before they strike, because they're not really communicating with anybody else. So there's no communication to intercept, and they basically have no limits on what they can do. They're not answering to anybody. The only bright side of all this is that some of them do feel this need to do a manifesto or to post something on social media before they attack. The problem is sometimes there's not enough time before that's discovered and they strike. But I see the lone wolf continuing to be the major threat. Access to any kind of weapons, whether it's shootings or bombings or knife attacks or whatever it may be. And you also have the problem of the lone wolf who may be mentally ill and is not even really aware of what they're doing.
Do you see the open borders as a terrorist threat?
Not necessarily. I mean, I'm not the expert on the immigration and on
No,
border.
it's I'm just talking about from the perspective of that people that could be on, say, the
Oh,
terrorist watch
oh,
list
yeah, no,
are coming across the border unvetted
oh yeah,
many
no, no,
times.
definitely in that sense, yeah, because basically, they could blend in with the people who really are fleeing from turmoil or wanting to have a life in the U.S. But yeah, so in that case, yes, then does become a problem.
You also mentioned, and this is where I think it gets a little cloudy too. Active shooters, um, and you mentioned the mental health issues with active shooters, and sometimes it is a mental health issue, and it's not specifically terrorism, but it's being called a terrorist act. Look at the guy in Buffalo that just
Yeah,
went into that supermarket. I mean, that was
yeah,
horrific. You
yeah.
know, I guess I would consider that a terrorist act.
See, here's the whole problem with terrorism. There's no consensus definition of what is terrorism. Usually, for something to be terrorism, it has to be a political or a religious motive. But the irony of that is you take a mass shooting, whether in a school or whatever, if they don't leave any note or if there's no, political motive, it can't really be called terrorism, even though the effect is still the same. But if they simply left a note, I'm doing this because US is killing children somewhere else or your government is doing this, then we call it terrorism. So it's almost better to do away with the word terrorism and look at the effects of these different acts, which cause the terror and cause the problems. But and then you go to workplace violence. What's terrorism and what then is called workplace violence, and it becomes very murky.
No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. After all, you are the doctor, but yeah, I,
I, I
I,
can't
I
I can't I can't cure anything, right?
no, but
If
I think you're
if
right
you're
about
sick,
that. Sometimes I guess the word terrorism is overused, that it loses its meaning, and like you said, there usually has to be a political reason for the act, and if it's not, how we sort of defining everything as a terroristic act.
yeah, and that reason doesn't even have to be clear cut. Some of these lone wolves will do something and just throw out a slogan or throw out, "I did it for ISIS," or I did it for protest this policy or whatever. So there's a whole range of the motivations and the backgrounds of the terrorists. But going back to that question, I see that lone wolf as really being the main threat that we're facing.
Absolutely. And what in your studies do you recommend ways for law enforcement to combat terrorism? Especially you talk about IEDs, improvised explosive devices,
Mm.
and we haven't seen a lot of that in this country. I mean, we very well could be. Of course, Israel was one of the main places where IEDs were being used.
Yeah.
And how about Ireland years ago with the IRA?
Right.
They were doing the same type of thing. And you mentioned now the 1920s, these
Yeah.
bombs were probably pipe bombs, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Pipe bombs.
And look at
Well,
the
except yeah, not
Murrah
the
building.
yeah.
I was talking about Timothy McVeigh and the Murrah building. They used fertilizer,
That's
right?
right. That's right. Yeah.
In a U-Haul truck, which was sort of an infamous thing. And no one before that occurred, no one knew that you could make a bomb that way.
Yeah. And what's interesting about the Oklahoma City bombing is that 2 years before that we had the World Trade Center car bombing, the truck bombing. So once it was
1993.
93. So
Yeah.
95, news breaks out. Oh, Oklahoma City, there's a bombing at the Federal Building. Everybody jumps to the conclusion that it was the Islamic extremists because we tend to, in this country, react, and every country does it, to what the latest incident is and think that's going to be our threat going forward. And that catches us, we get caught off guard. So then when it was a good old American boy looks so clean cut, then wait, now we have the militia threat. We have, this kind of issue going on. And then you have the World Trade Center bombing, so it's, the 9/11 attack. So,
Right.
the terrorism goes in circles and it's hard for law enforcement, intelligence agencies to try to prevent these attacks, but it's good intelligence, cooperation, and again, monitoring the social media, monitoring the internet, because that's where you can find, maybe not from the lone wolf, but from organized groups, the chatter, the communication, what's happening that will give you some lead time to be able to, investigate.
Well, whenever one of these acts happen, it always the journalists are always looking for whether did the FBI know about this,
Right.
and a lot of times they do, but how can we define what they should do, what level of response should they have when they get in hundreds and thousands of reports
Right.
of things? What triggers that? Okay, we got to go pick these guys up, or we got to interview them, or we got to do this, we got to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Difficult. I mean, we talk about 9/11. It would seem obvious to an amateur sleuth that people that are taking flying lessons in Florida and only want to learn how to fly the plane in the air, they don't want to learn how to take off the
Mhm.
land, that should make, but something, was it that obvious? I don't know.
No, you can't. Exactly. There's so many. It's easy, in hindsight, to put the blame somewhere. The only thing about 9/11 that wasn't surprising was that terrorists always have to try to do something different or something more violent to rise above the normal flow of terrorism, so people pay attention. So there were car bombings on the ground. There was a attack at sea. The USS Cole. So it was only a matter of time before terrorists were going to strike from above, but that still is just too general. How do you pinpoint that it's going to be, the Twin Towers?
I think probably the scariest thing is that, and we already know that they have access to drones.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if they start using drones for terrorist activity, that certainly is a scary thing.
Oh, totally, totally. And terrorists, it's a technological race. It's a never-ending technological race. And we talked about some dumb terrorists, but there are also some smart terrorists. And there are terrorists always thinking, what's the next technique I could use? And law enforcement and those combating terrorism, we have to try to think ahead of them. And you have to think like the terrorists. What are they, plan? What do you think they can do, and how can they do it?
And how can we stop the next attack from occurring? Yeah, well, that's one good thing is that they do have the Joint Terrorist Task Force with the FBI and the local police, and that's one good way to thwart these things. The
Absolutely.
um, the book is The Bulldog Detective, Dr. Jeffrey D. Simon, and you see that rotund guy on the left. He's the Bulldog Detective William J. Flynn, and America's first war against the mafia, spies, and terrorists. In addition, well, there's a picture of Dr. Simon selling his books there. He's smiling. I think he must have
Yeah.
sold a lot of books that day.
That was a couple of years ago on this alphabet bomber book I wrote. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I wanted to pull up if I have it. I don't know if I have it listed here. You've written 4 books, right?
This is the fifth. This is the fifth book.
This is the fifth. You want to just list them here?
Yeah. Okay. First book I wrote was called The Terrorist Trap: America's Experience with Terrorism. I wrote that in 1994. Did the research in the 80s. Then I had Lone Wolf Terrorism: Understanding the Growing Threat. That was 2013. Then The Alphabet Bomber: A Lone Wolf Terrorist Ahead of His Time. That was 2019. And then 2022 was America's Forgotten Terrorists: The Rise and Fall of the Gallianis, and now The Bulldog Detective.
Wow, quite impressive. Is there any possibility that the Bulldog Detective could make it to the big screen?
I've been trying that. I've been pursuing that. It's hard, everybody
No,
tells
I
you.
I
They say,
talk to writers all the time,
"Oh," they
and
say, "This would make a great movie." And I say, "Yeah." And I've been trying to make contacts, and but nothing yet. But I'm hoping, because I could just see, it'd be just a great story. So many aspects of his life, and you could pick one or pick them all, but you can really make a dramatic story out of it.
A friend of mine, a retired detective named Tommy Dades, and a retired Brooklyn prosecutor named Michael Vecchione, they wrote a book called Friends of the Family,
Oh,
which is about the mafia cops,
sure.
Ippolito and Caracappa, who are actually doing hits for the mafia while they were New York City detectives.
Yeah.
And they've been trying to have that made into a movie for years. And a couple of times it's been like, oh, it's gonna go, it's gonna, and then it falls apart.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's a
yeah,
great,
yeah.
great story, just like your story is a great story.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, like Flynn can never give up. Have to be like the bulldog and just keep at it to try to
You'd
get
be
it.
the bulldog doctor, the bulldog writer.
Oh, yeah, I should have used that. Darn, I should have that as the moniker now.
Dr. Simon, your final words.
Um, everybody, no matter how bad things may look, first of all, we're still incredibly lucky to live in the United States. You look around the world, and when there are terrorist attacks, uh, we'll get through them. I mean, I know this sounds, very easy to say, but we just have to, keep ahead and keep be aware. Awareness is important in terms of any suspicious packages, but law enforcement, police are doing a great job, and I feel safe in America.
That old expression, I think it was invented in New York after 9/11. If you see something, say something, right?
Absolutely.
That's out there all the time. So, folks, the book is The Bulldog Detective. You can get it on Amazon, excuse me. Dr. Jeffrey D. Simon, and this is the fifth one of his books. And this seems like it's quite an interesting book. Perhaps we'll see it on the big screen one day. Dr.
Okay.
Simon, I want to really thank you for coming on the show today. As I told you, I said earlier, we'll do 45 minutes to an hour. And before you know it, I guess both of us like to talk. We start talking, and we covered a lot of different areas here, though. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed this. This was great.
Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Okay. Take care now. Bye.
One episode just ain't enough.